I have done interviews with the American press. Picture was ready only weeks before it opened, but I did see, I don't know, 9 or 10 American press. I also don't particularly enjoy the interviews. I always feels under the obligation to say some witty, brilliant summary related to film style or technique. You know, some critics say it, and it isn't really meaningful in terms of whatever one thought oneself about. Well, it's more difficult only in the sense that it doesn't involve social topical issues. One can talk around instead of talking about the film. You know, with Dr. Strangelove, you could talk about the problems of nuclear war. 2001, you could talk about extraterrestrial or future social structures. I've never found it meaningful or even possible to talk about film aesthetics in terms of my own film. I must say that the American reviews, most of the reviews were very favorable. In fact, they were some of the best reviews I've ever gotten. Certain critics in America that have not liked any of my films. Some of them go back to Paths of Glory. Pauline Kael, John Simon, Stanley Kaufman, Andrew Saris, the New York group. And the thing I have noticed with many critics, they become committed to a view. And although they could possibly, if they were overwhelmed one way or the other, shift, they tend to have formulated an attitude about certain people. They either like everything they do or don't like. Mass psychology of film critics is hard to interpret. It's always been the result of all my pictures, whatever they are. There's always been a group that doesn't like, and there's new reasons every time, and it never relates to the last reason. I don't know why it is. But the English reaction I can't explain except to say most of the English critics aren't particularly good. And some of the ones who are serious, I don't know. I think the last picture where the English critics have been very positive was Dr. Strangelove. I don't know, there obviously are cultural differences in reactions to film. Kurosawa went absolutely crazy over the picture. Peter Brook, who I never met, sent me a note from Paris. Well, I mean, I don't know what led me to make any of the films, really, that I've made. I became interested in them when I read them or when I thought about the subject. So I'm now going through the problem of trying to decide what film to make next, and I realize that my own thought processes are very hard to define in terms of what story do you want to make into a film. You can say a lot of things about what it should be. It should be an interesting story, offer possibilities for cinematic beauty in terms of photography and editing, and in the end, truthful and honest in dealing with the thematic material. That doesn't really tell you why you finally choose something. It does become this very indefinable, like, why do you find one particular girl attractive, or why did you marry your wife? I have a complete set of Thackeray, and I've read other Thackeray. Vanity Fair interested me at one time, but I felt the story couldn't be successfully compressed in even a relatively short period of 3 hours into a film. I liked it.
Is it also the fact that you wanted to make, at one moment, Napoleon, this kind of hunger for doing something historical?
If it was unconscious. Historical films offer possibilities of doing the sort of things that movies do better than anything else, recreating atmosphere, just as futuristic films do. Description is the most boring thing in a novel, whereas in a movie, what you put on the screen is a great effort to the makers of the film. I suppose I would always be attracted to something which offered interesting visual possibilities, but no, it just fell into that indefinable area of wanting to do it.
Has there been historical movies that give you clues or that you found satisfying?
I can't think of any offhand. Most historical films have not been good. I think one of the best ones was it Rossellini who did that French television.
Louis XIV.
Yeah. That's one of the very few that I can think of.
Have you seen La
Marseillaise de Renoir?
Yeah. I liked it, but it seemed to have many of the defects of historical movies.
Do you like writing alone? Or?
I would love to write with someone who I found stimulating and on the same wavelength. The only person that I've ever felt that with was with Arthur Clarke when we were working on the original story. But when you get into the filming, let's say frequently many adjustments in the plot have to be made. One of the paradoxes of movies is that people who really can write don't write films unless they're directors, in which case, they're writing for themselves. You never stop writing it. I mean, that's the other thing. But I suppose the first draft probably took, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. But the thing is, you never stop changing. I wish that were true. There are always other things that are happening. But I find that the structure, the events, if they're right, if the moments are right, it usually is fairly simple to write the scene. There are times in various films where there hasn't even been time to write the scene. It's never been solved until, say, 2 days before you do it. You just couldn't think. Once you know what's supposed to happen, really sort of write the scene on the actors, as it were, in the rehearsal. I mean, that part of the scene, the dialogue, is not the most difficult. It isn't in this type of story. It is obviously in a film where someone's going to sit and talk for 30 minutes in one place, like a play. When the attitude of the people is correct and the purpose of the scene is correct and the action of the scene is interesting, then the rest of it is pretty simple. The first person in the book was useful because he presented the story and you had to reason through the real facts, and if you did that in a film and you saw objective reality, the film would have to be comedy, and somehow it didn't really seem to lend itself to being comic. It worked for the novel, it just didn't seem to me it would work. Well, there was too much story to tell. I like using a narrator to spare you from the labor of expositional scenes, It's a technique that I think, works very well when you have a broad canvas. It's almost impossible not to use it, I think. Become burdened with exposition. One of the techniques of the novel that I did keep, that Thackeray always warned you in advance. I felt that this was important because, first of all, it was in the book, and it seemed to me it kept it made the twists and turns of the story inevitable unless popping up like a jack-in-the-box by him anticipating major changes and warning. It immediately establishes a relationship which might be less believable without. It tends to be a story of, which doesn't depend on surprise in terms of what's going to happen, but how. If you saw a film about the sinking of the Titanic, and you didn't know that it was going to sink, you'd wonder what 90% of the film was about before it hit the ice. So there is another way to tell a story. There is a different kind of suspense by being told in advance of impending disaster and then seeing how it develops. It is a little bit like a detective looking for clues. I created a picture file of thousands of drawings and paintings, that we could have wanted. I think I destroyed every art book that you can buy in a bookshop by tearing the pages out and tried to make it look like the paintings. The costumes were all copied from paintings. I think this has become, the only, a respectable, in fact, the only sensible way to do historical costumes. It's stupid to have a designer interpret the 18th century as they may remember it from art school or from a few pictures they get together. Nobody could have the feeling, even if they academically studied it, nobody could have a feeling for designing clothes out of their own period. Very few people have a feeling for designing clothes in their own period. It is fun accumulating the information. It's part of the problem that you have to learn something, in depth about something that you start off knowing very little about. It has to have the appearance of being realistic. Since part of the problem of any story is to make you believe things that are more crucial, like the behavior of the characters in the story. Certainly getting a realistic atmosphere and an interesting atmosphere, especially if it's not a contemporary period, is, you might just say, just necessary as a starting point. It also obviously has another area of pleasure in seeing visual beauty and seeing the recreation of a historical period.
Yes, but the same way as the danger of the picaresque is that you can lose yourself in detail.
No, I mean, you could have a film that wouldn't be interesting whether there was detail or no detail. The thing is, if you do a contemporary thing, you don't have the problem because it's there, and you certainly are in no danger of losing yourself in detail. All you're really trying to do is to get things if you were shooting on a location in 1976. Something that I've always been very bothered by in period films is the light on interiors. When you see a room that's entirely lit by candles, it just looks completely different, and it's, of course, very beautiful. I wanted to do this, and I found this lens. Had this camera specially. I think the night scenes are particularly beautiful.
But John Alcott said in American Cinematographer that somehow it was impossible sometimes.
Well, but this is true. If you shot in this office now, you might have a very weak fill-in light because the light from the window is, would be too contrasty. Well, with the candles, we had very, very weak light sort of bouncing off the ceiling. But what they would generally call the key light.
And for the windows?
Daylight windows?
Yes.
Well, those were always, again, attempting to look like daylight, but in fact they were always lights outside the window. Well, I mean, you might say that no film should ever be made which doesn't look as realistic as possible. Well, I mean, for most of the elegant rooms, it would be almost out of the question. Once you're shooting as many scenes as we did, the smaller scenes just fill in as cover for exteriors or things like that. There was no point in both being in Wiltshire and then having to come back to studios in London. It was far easier to do everything on location. Oh, well, any historical film, as I say, it's very much like a science fiction trying to create something that doesn't exist. People have written a lot about that lens. Once the lens was purchased and the camera was adapted for it, then it just was no different than any other lens. It was just fast. Candlelight, of course, looks completely different. The paintings that are done in candlelight, the colors look the way they do. There's no way of putting filters on lamps. One had never seen movies photographed in candlelight. Well, I think that one of the things that characterizes some of the failures of 20th century art is obsession with total originality, in painting, music. Even take, people, innovators like Beethoven and so on. I mean, it isn't a complete departure from the music that preceded him. I think that culturally, any kind of innovation means, moving it forward, but not abandoning, what you could, although it's hard to use a phrase like this in movies, but, the classical form of the art form.
For instance, about the use of music, you have apparently completely...
well, I wouldn't abandon it if I was using contemporary music, but I just don't see how, if you're using orchestral music, why should you go to a 100th rate? I should think it must be like that composer. There's no point in having somebody try to write something like Mozart.
No, I wasn't saying that.
Well, in 2001 I used Ligeti. Well, let's say 2001 you could have gotten somebody to write it specially, but it's such a colossal gamble, and it's done at the last minute. If you're not happy with it, it's always done 12 weeks or something. So if you find the music that seems right, it seems pointless to not to use it. Schubert was an interesting problem. At first, I wanted to stick entirely to 18th century music, although there's no rule that says you have to. I think I now have every piece of 18th century music that's been recorded. I listened to everything very carefully. Unfortunately, there is no passion. There's nothing even remotely that could pass for a love theme that has a tragic, passionate feeling that the Schubert trio had. So I finally cheated a few years, and it still had a feeling of tragic romance. The other thing you don't find in 18th century music is dramatic. We did talk about it at great length, and did actually talk about the instrumentation. I actually heard this played on a guitar. It seemed to me the nearest thing that you could come to Morricone, still not do something that seemed like a terrible anomaly, in the story. And in fact, when we recorded it, we even experimented with different combinations. Basically, there were very few instruments. To keep it from being a musical anomaly, we didn't want to get into any involved orchestrational textures, and this seemed to suit the purposes. It could be emotional, it could be a sad version of it, and it could be a dramatic version. The rest of the film was the chieftains.
Music is also important in the characters' relationship, because the first concert, Bullingdon is there.
Those are those patterns again. He was just the best actor who we found to play the part.
Because Alex looks like an 18th century character.
Well, they both happen to look similar.
How do you direct actors?
Well, first of all, you discuss the character in general, and then you discuss the scene. You know, what the character's real attitude is in the scene, which frequently isn't exactly what it appears to be, in terms of the story. Then comes this terrible moment of the first time that you actually rehearse a scene in the place you're going to shoot it. It's always a surprise. It's never what you thought it would be. The text usually has to be changed in some way or another. New ideas occur, old ideas are dropped. And at that point, it then becomes relatively easy. The actual shooting usually is not the problem. The problem is before you're ready to shoot. Once everybody knows what they're doing, and you know that it's good or interesting, strain really is making the thing happen. It's doing what it should do.
The attitude towards the character, I felt that you feel divided towards.
Thackeray called it a novel without a hero. It is, it is what you've described is the way Barry's actions and his ambitions and so forth do leave you feeling ambivalent. I don't see how you can have no sympathy for him. The weakness of his character, the trap that he places himself in as a result of his ambitions, and the limitation of his personality that arises from, the cynicism which develops from, his early relationships with people. He then becomes a very, limited person. He certainly is not a conventional hero or even a conventional villain. I mean, most people are like that. It is tragic, but then, melodrama, uses all the problems of the world and all the disasters which befall the main characters. The world is benevolent and fair. All the tests and trials and seeming misfortunes which occur in the end just reinforce this belief. But honesty, or an attempt at presenting life, can leave you with a feeling of desolation.
This last sentence, they are all equal now. Christian or nihilistic?
No, it seemed a very, they were all dead.
You believer?
No, it just seemed to me, and I guess to Thackeray, a very good postscript to the story.
But I'm not thinking only about Barry Lyndon, but your films in general, so you can't protect yourself great despair.
I wouldn't say, honestly, I think that, I do think that the comparison between melodrama and honesty does depend, I suppose, on the weight that you give it, but basically, if you use all the difficulties which befall the main characters of the stories to, in the end, reinforce a belief, then you're not really saying what things appear to be. How disappointing you make the end of a film is a matter of, I suppose, taste or artistic balance, whatever it is. But, you always are faced with the problem of, are you going to try to reinforce this illusion which melodrama fosters, or are you going to reflect what one sees about life? I wouldn't say that it's
nihilistic.
Yeah. No, I think it's realistic. No, I mean, does the world seem to you a benevolent and fair place?
No.
Yeah.
No.
The solution may only be that it's possible to carry on, despite all these things that one has observed. Certainly the solution doesn't have to pretend that the world is a different place than it appears to be. The world is that way doesn't mean that everything is going to come to a stop, or that people don't get pleasure from their lives. The formula approach, which presents the world in a way other than it is, doesn't seem to have a great deal of merit unless you're making entertainment.
You get the feeling from your films, and particularly this one, that the world is at war all the time.
Well, first of all,
the apes are fighting.
Well, I mean, in a work of fiction, you have to have conflict. You couldn't have a story where something wasn't wrong. Well, even in The Sound of Music, something goes wrong. In addition to which, it's not an inact the way most people are structured. How many happy marriages are there, and how many stepfathers love their stepsons, and how many stepsons love their stepfather? How often do people who have ambitions which only involve money, how often do they find it satisfying, especially in his case, where it virtually paralyzes all of his activity. You know, from a sort of psychological pattern, you could say that while he is struggling and out in the world, which he doesn't like, but at least his life is vital. From the time he gets married and he accomplishes what he thinks he's going to get, everything just becomes gray and dismal and wearing away at him. He's completely unsuited for the life, and so he puts himself into a gilded cage. And then on, everything goes sour.
You play chess and so on.
Play if I find somebody.
Because in the film there are duels and games and gambling.
But I mean, most films are like they're almost like an athletics contest. Depending on where the ball bounces and where people are standing, opportunities arise, which if you can exploit, just make it better. Marvelous James Joyce quote. He said something about accidents suddenly open up entrances into things that you hadn't thought of, and obviously, if you exploit them correctly, they add a dimension to what you're doing, which, if you ignore, is very limiting. Most films most films are
not 2000.
Well, that's not true. There were accidents in 2001. I mean, certainly in the story. I was a pretty good chess player. I used to play in the Marshall and the Manhattan chess clubs in New York. I was not, obviously, a great chess player, but it teaches you to overcome the initial excitement of something that looks good and to analyze it. Even Bobby Fischer or Karpov cannot see to the end of the game. I mean, they can analyze deeper than anybody else, but none of them can see all the way. Part of the decision is based on the analysis and the rest on the feeling. When you're making a film, basically you have to, once you start, you have to make most of your decisions on some sort of intuitive basis. There really isn't time. You have to make so many decisions that you couldn't possibly really sit down and analyze to any great extent. But at least, even if you stop for a minute, you will prevent yourself from making a mistake where something looks initially attractive, but when you really think about it, it isn't right. It's more, I would say chess is more for preventing you from making mistakes than it is for giving you ideas. The ideas seem to come spontaneously and seem to be born whole. But the discipline of examining them and not just saying, oh, that sounds great. I think that's something which chess teaches. It also teaches you to, thinking on a movie. There's millions of people moving around. Money is being spent at a very rapid rate. Most of the mistakes you see in films are really because people just don't even, it wouldn't, if they avoided the mistakes, you wouldn't see so many things that everybody in the audience sees as stupid. But nobody seemed to realize it when they were doing it. I think it's really because there's an awful lot of filming that goes on where people literally just don't think for a moment. They get an idea, they just do it. After Barry Lyndon, I've never had another film clearly in mind as I was making a film. Whenever I finish a film, I just start to read. Waste a lot of time. I wish I could make films more often, but this just came to. Well, it must have been 4 or 5 months after the film came out. I don't find any systematic way of reading. It's a terrifying prospect to when you realize all the books there are in the world that you're never going to read. So what you should read. So I find by just reading at random, that seems like the best approach since there's no systematic way. Well, in this case, it was the fiction. Just like everybody else, I'm fascinated by the various experiments and the stories which have been published about ESP and psychokinesis. But it certainly didn't start with a desire to do something on that subject. The book was sent to me in a manuscript form by John Calley. I've always enjoyed the genre, and I felt that I hadn't really seen a picture that presented, that genre. There have been pictures which have had shocks in them and which have had some wonderfully gory or horrific moments, but to properly, present that type of a story in a way where you could disbelief and get involved in the story, and the supernatural events were presented in a way which seemed dramatically realistic. What I found so ingenious about the way the novel was written, as the various supernatural events occurred, you always wonder to yourself, how is the writer ever going to explain this? The way the story is written, you assume, as you read it, that the things that are happening are probably going to be a product of his imagination. And I think this allows you to start accepting them and not worry. It isn't really until the bolt is open that you're absolutely certain that it isn't a product of imagination, because he couldn't open the bolt. It wasn't a great work of literature in the sense that the writing was marvelous or that the characters were particularly well presented. In a story like this, it didn't really matter that the plot was the cardinal point, and that characterization and everything else, when you make a movie out of it, could be improved.
But don't you think that it's somehow today it's in popular literature like that you find strong archetypes which for cinema are extremely fit?
Well, there's no doubt that I think that both novelists and filmmakers, consciously or unconsciously, are encountering the problem of what importance is a story. Is it more than just a way of keeping people's attention while you exercise the more subtle aspects of the medium that you're working with? Or is the story the most important thing, or is the story just holding your interest? Execution of the art form becomes what the artist is interested in. I think that realistic fiction and realistic drama must be encountering some limits now, where people feel that it either takes too long to make a point, and nobody has any profound answers to anything. I suppose you could also say that just as a ghost story has its basic appeal in its promise of immortality, it's possible that many types of genre material are really ways of thinking about death. A classical love story always ends with a death of one or both of the lovers, or certainly their eternal separation. That too has the promise that at least when you die, someone will care. I haven't really completed this. I have a suspicion that on a psychological level, dramatic plots may function on that level.
And once you had decided to pick up this film, that the fiction drew you?
I think it's entirely possible that ESP has been proven to exist, and that even other forms of the occult and psychokinetic experiments and reports are true. But I wish somebody would prove it a little more conclusively. Mm-hmm. But it's also possible that it's the kind of thing which cannot be tested in the way that they've tried. I've certainly seen behavior in dogs and cats seem fairly conclusive proof that there is a non-verbal form of mental communication. I have a cat who hates to have her combed. And, I mean, this has happened, I should think, a dozen times. I've only to sort of touch her and think about it, not even move, and she'll suddenly just dive under the bed and hide. Before I even move, now I touch her all the time, she often has knots. Now, I think to myself, well, I must be, maybe I'm doing something, I'm moving. I think that in some way, she can tell that I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. Telephone ring. We made models.
Yes.
Of all the rooms in the hotel. First of all, we decided that since it was a supernatural story, that we didn't want to have any kind of impressionistic set. You know, an art director's idea of what a hotel full of ghosts would look like. We wanted it to look like a real hotel. And this also was carried forward into the lighting and everything else. It always seemed to me that the guide for this sort of thing was the way Kafka writes, as opposed to the films that have been made. Kafka writes in a very simple, almost journalistic style. All the films have these bizarre sets and strange-looking things. And none of those Kafka films, as far as I'm concerned, have ever really worked. Kafka should be done, you know, like a very simple, straightforward, like it's real. Once we decided that it should be look as realistic as possible, went all over America photographing different hotels. And then, to make it absolutely correct, every single detail was copied. You know, we didn't fall into the trap, what I think is a trap, of, you know, haunted hotel look. When you do read reports of people who have seen ghosts and things like that, they always describe them as being as solid and real as someone standing in the room. Only in movies has the convention come up of ghosts being ethereal. The descriptions I've ever read where people actually claim they've seen ghosts, that people are very solid and real, and it takes place in very ordinary. You know, it was important to go against the cliche of, I mean, this gets into one of those fundamental questions that most art directors would argue with you about. Do you try to imagine something, or do you take a real hotel? It's like the way costumes used to be done in historical movies with Zeffirelli and Visconti. If you made a costume picture, that you'd get a costume designer, and from their vast store of culture, they would draw costumes for you. Visconti and Zeffirelli suddenly made it artistically acceptable to copy. Well, I think the same thing really is true in many instances with sets, if the real things are there. I mean, the other problem is the length of a movie. It imposes tremendous restrictions as to the amount of story you can ever tell. Certainly if you tell it in a conventional way, which this is told in a conventional way. I must say I still would like to make a movie which is structured more the way silent movies were structured than the way sound movies were. We started to talk earlier about sound. One of the prices that have been paid for sound is that movies always think of scenes in terms of theatrical scenes, you know, even if they're short, you know, they're thought of as a scene. Whereas in the silent movies, you could make a little simple statement like saying Bill's uncle, then you illustrate there's Bill's uncle on the back porch, you get on to something else. You had much greater scope, I think, in a narrative. I would certainly like to make a movie which told a story differently than a series of scenes which in most movies could be told on the stage. I mean, paying a very small price with a little bit of impressionistic stage lighting and scenery changes, you could almost, there's very few movies that could not have been told in a theater. It isn't so much saying something, it's the way you think of conveying information, and the dialogue tends to be the main way. I think that there's probably a much more cinematic way to do it, and it has much more to do with silent movies.
But people accepted it in 2001.
Even that, though, was seen. You know, there's a scene, somebody comes in, something... Scenes are of a certain length. I have a feeling that you could have a story that had much greater narrative scope. Certain things would merely be illustrated and other things would be dramatized. I mean, in most films, everything is dramatized. Nothing is just lightly illustrated and saves itself to decide which things need dramatic weight and which things could just be visually illustrated and just stated simply. I mean, only the silent films have done that, and TV commercials. 30 seconds, a point is made. Well, obviously, in this type of story, you are in an area where not only does intellectual exploration stop, but I mean, you're in an area where no one's even sure whether it's true, let alone how can you explain it. You know, if you, from a dramatic point of view, just accept saying it's true, you can't go much further than that. If it was true, how would it happen?
But it's a defeat of reason.
It's going into areas where reason is of no great help. I mean, reason simply, reason doesn't help you. You're in an area where, as I say, it's more like music, you know, than rational thought. You know, there are areas where rationality can take you up to the border, and from there on it's poetical or musical or imaginative. I think with this type of story, if you try to be verbally analytical, it becomes slightly ridiculous. Either you make too much of it, or you reduce it to some sort of ultra-clear absurdity. I think the musical or poetic sort of manipulation of the material is the most important thing. Did we ever talk about Freud's essay on the uncanny?
No.
He made an interesting point. He said that the uncanny, he said, is the only emotion or the only feeling which, for most people, is more powerfully experienced in art or literature than in life. Perhaps justification of the genre, you know, for whatever value it is. It is an interesting point. Obviously, our ability to get into the the most profound questions which we realize how rationalism takes you so far. You don't really feel it's far enough. Now, maybe going into it in a poetical or a musical sense isn't of any great value, but it's certainly a temptation to do it. But I mean, there's always a danger. People will always misinterpret it just simply to support a view which they held before they saw it. Most things really are people, you simply take from it what they already believe. I wonder what percent of people ever actually encounter work of art and it changes them a view that they have. Maybe if they're 15 or 16 years old or something. I have always been interested in Vietnam. I'm interested in a lot of things. This arose out of the chance encounter with the book, which I suppose is how all of them have come to be. In the course of reading, somebody sent me the book. I'm not even sure who. I was just immediately struck by the book. I was reading fiction, anything that sounded like it might be good, you know. I mean, this one came with a very good Virginia Kirkus review. Newsweek said on the cover, the best work of fiction about the Vietnam War. So it didn't take a lot of brains to read it. And it struck me as so original in its point of view and its economy of statement. You know, it leaves out all of the mandatory scenes that every war film has, which, you know, fill you in, you know, on who everybody is. You only find out about the people in the course of the main action of the story. And then very economically, you know, no one has the big character speeches that slow the films down and are obviously unnecessary. People seem to identify very strongly with the characters and pick and get a sense of relationships from the most economical. The first thing I thought, and this I think is common of all the books that I've done that were really interesting, and I thought is, my God, I really enjoyed that. Could you actually make a movie from that? There's something about the originality of attitude. It doesn't suggest anything that you've seen before. You don't immediately go click and say, right, another Star Wars, or, you know, another Godfather, you know, or something like that. Books that seem safe, they're familiar, and people have done things like it. And the tone of this movie is unique. It struck me when it's so fresh and original and uncompromisingly truthful. You couldn't really say, is it an anti-war book, is it a pro-war book? Phrases like that seem to become irrelevant. It just seemed to be, you know, a work of art, which probably can be misunderstood by everybody. You know, I can see some people saying, you know, in certain ways it glorifies war, and other people will say it's very unfair and it shows American troops as this, that, the other. But strangely enough, it doesn't seem to make any difference now. The people seem to respond to it dramatically, as well as intellectually, depending on who they are, you know. Gustav Hasford is the veteran. Hasford has made a lot of statements that really are not part of the book. Subsequently, he's become more politicized. But I think when he wrote the book, he was really just working as an artist. Now, if you interview him, you know, he'll sound like he had some point of view to expound, but I don't think it's there in the book. They were obviously more cynical than any other troops, but they express it in the interview. The thing that characterizes the Vietnam vet, which is not in the film, is that they were the first of almost any war that came home, and instead of having their guilt relieved by being told they were heroes, were told that they had done something bad. So a lot of them suffered a lot of psychological, you know, problems. Because, you know, the guilt that you feel as a soldier is to a great extent relieved when they tell you you did something wonderful and you fought for your country even if you lost. Even the German soldiers, when they came back, were probably looked on by the people. I start by reading the book a lot of times, saying, let's, you know, this could be the first scene, what could be the next scene? And then make an outline. If you have any new ideas, as you see, there are a couple of important scenes that are not in the book, like the editorial office discussion, where they talk about the stories he's supposed to write. That's not in the book at all. Although there's something related to it, but not that scene. First you say, well, what could be the next scene? You know, what are you going to leave out? And then, what is lacking, and have you any ideas for other scenes? But it's more a matter then of just working subjectively rather than sort of getting back into getting an architectural view of the whole thing.
But the editorial office discussion reminds me of, Seven Seas.
Yeah, but I think the most important thing about that was that it, in a very witty and economical way, dramatized one of the other central features of the war was the manipulation of the reality of the war by technocrats and hawk intellectuals, always finding light at the end of the tunnel and encouraging the men there to lie and to exaggerate, kill ratios. If any shots were fired in the bush, they were always encouraged to say, well, they didn't have any bodies, but they saw drag marks. In fact, the Marine newspaper that Hassler worked for are just full of stories. He says, we run two types of stories. Half they're paid to buy Goog's toothbrushes and deodorants, winning hearts and minds, and combat actions that result in a kill, winning the war. So I think the scene presented a sense of the cynical manipulation of the truth in a very amusing, entertaining way. Well, it's a bit like the generals and the men in Paths of Glory. It's always that way. It was more than just the ambition of the generals versus the men's lives. There was an arrogance back in Washington by these, quote, intellectuals who ran the war like an advertising campaign. And of course, ironically, they paid a price for this because in the Tet Offensive, even though the North suffered a tremendous military defeat, where all of the carefully harbored forces that they had been building up and supplies that they had been bringing down on the Ho Chi Minh Trail by bicycle were squandered away. They thought people would actually rise up and join them. Because of the lying, the press and the public were so shocked that there was this strength in the North that it was the turning point of the war. The war was probably unwinnable. The war was unwinnable, not because of the Tet Offensive. The war was also unlosable, but it was unwinnable. We have a country, that's feeding, forces into another country, and you have this 500-mile border on the west, the infiltration that nothing could stop. And the South Vietnamese, not really supporting their government because they were corrupt and inept. There's a lot of evidence that any South Vietnamese officer, general, who actually was prepared to fight was quickly booted out because for fear he might represent a political rival. The generals, the high command of the South Vietnamese army, were all people who simply avoided combat. Everybody was in doubt, except for a few, lunatics. Everyone felt it was unwinnable. Hartman's, his name was changed in the film. That speech, those speeches, drill instructors had been making to Marines in the beginning of the Marine Corps. A lot of people who've seen the film, who were Marines in 1940, said the same speech, the same guy. Same sort of thing probably goes on in the Foreign Legion or any sort of elite fighting force. Marines die, that's what we're here for. But the Marine Corps lives forever, and that means you live forever. It's sort of, I remember reading that these Moroccan troops in the Spanish Civil War used to say they had some cry about death. I would think there's a universality about his speeches in any, really 100% dedicated fighting force. It makes it very clear that fighting means killing, it doesn't mean anything else. Since I have always found it very easy to do the visual side of movies, I never even worry. The problem with audiences is the story. Movies are not disappointing because they're disappointing visually. They're disappointing because they're just boring, and there's nothing about them that really moves you or gets to your imagination. I would say your problem more is where do good stories come from? Is there ever going to be a way to combine the structure of the silent movie with the quick presentation of an ideal of the TV commercial? Maybe a poet has to do it, because I don't know. A novelist will never do it. A playwright will never do it. And if you're not a writer, you probably never do it. So somewhere, somebody has to be able to take the wonderful economical, structural possibilities of a silent movie with the tremendous power that a good TV commercial can generate on a topic in 30 seconds. I still think this would be the most exciting thing that happened since whoever it was cut the two films together and realized you could have editing. You really needed sort of like an editing of the mind, which hasn't happened. Just tell a story in a different way. I mean, I think visually it is beautiful, but I think the thing that is so striking about the film is the story and the sense that you get of the reality, the kind of reality that the film presents. This is what people are, being blown away by, apparently in America. I don't think they've ever actually been hit by this kind of an impression. I think they're responding to really to the story and to the tone. Television is a good influence because TV commercials are so beautifully realized that it's making movie cameramen more aware of what they should be doing. Movie directors realize that there's something there besides just saying, to the operator, a me figure shot in this direction. Real explosion will come when someone finally liberates the narrative structure.
But what you quoted, which is the end of the movie, at the end you are alive.
Yeah, and he says when he looks at the mass grave, the dead know only one thing: it's better to be alive. If you're looking for a statement like that, I suppose you could say that's as good as any. Ending a war film has special problems because how do you end them? If you don't kill the character, find out what happens after he gets home, there's just a mechanical problem of how do you end a war film. I mean, some stories end by him being wounded, some by being killed, and that's it.
But it's the survival, it's the life instinct.
By the way, something you may not realize, the Mickey Mouse song that they sing, in America, the Mickey Mouse Club was on television. The idea of that was simply to suggest the lost innocence of these boys who, not that many years ago, were singing that song, watching the Mickey Mouse Club. I realized people in England didn't know what it was. They thought it was just a song. That was a very powerful, important bit of American nostalgia. The first thing we did, we hadn't decided where to film. I had done tremendous research. I had thousands of stills and as much documentary footage as we could get from archives. First thing I noticed was that the architecture in the peripheral areas where so much of the fighting seemed to be, was this sort of 1930s industrial functionalism. By the sheerest accident, we found this area that is about a square mile, and it was designed by a German architect in the 30s, and it looked exactly like photographs we'd seen in Voix and Saigon, the outskirts of the city. And it was scheduled for demolition. Then got permission to do anything we wanted. We could blow any buildings up, burn them down, knock holes in them. And it just seemed like a miracle, because I don't know where, looking back, I don't know how we would have done those things. A tiny fraction of the reality and interest. Then it was clear that if that was here, then the rest of it was pretty easy, because things like landing zones and roads. If you go into marshes at the right time of year, we have tall yellow grass, and put some, tropical plants and palm trees, it just looked exactly like the shots looked in Vietnam. It seemed easy to do it here, and well, as I say, more than easy, because this play, I don't know how we would have found anything like it anywhere. And if we had been allowed to film in Voix, we'd never have achieved this, vision of hell that actually Voix looked like. You've seen photographs. It looks like some of the photographs look like an atomic bomb hit it. It's just, flat.
So what did you shoot?
All of the fighting in the city. We blew up a lot of buildings, knocking holes into them with a ball, wrecking ball. And then also added features to the buildings, which we saw in the Vietnamese photographs, grills and signs. This wasn't really a set. This was like a location, which we could do what we wanted to. You don't really know what you're going to do. And this starts from, the story, the screenplay. Even when you go out in the morning to shoot the scene, you've thought about it. You hope that what you think it will be like will be a reality when you get there. Presented with the final reality of it. At the time we were writing the script, I had really a completely open mind. In fact, I remember even looking at footage of the French town that was preserved, Oradour, where they've preserved, it looked like what it was. And I didn't think they were about to let you blow it up or burn it down. We didn't really know where to do it. We were thinking about a place like this, couldn't imagine where you'd ever find one, and because we burned so much fire that it was quite nicely isolated. We had a lot of complaints, but nothing like you'd have had. We were almost shut down once. We had to stop shooting The smoke was just, I mean, a cloud of smoke about 500 feet high. Slowly start drifting across the Thames, you know, where people were going insane.
Obviously, you are interested by the problem of violence in all your films.
Sure. Obviously, some very good stories have been written about war, and I happen to have read them. You can't do a story about nuclear peace. Dr. Strangelove, you know, and, you know, it is, the chance encounter with the book is the whole thing. I must tell you, I have not found many books that, that I've turned down that I thought would make good movies. There's an interesting irony, too, in the fact that in order to train the Marines to be really told, you know, pounded into their heads, this thing about your rifle is only a tool, it's a hard heart that kills, your killer instinct, and so on. And yet, of course, in the end, this little 12-year-old Eurasian angel has shot 3 men in the most merciless way and tried to kill Joe, and obviously didn't need to be trained at Paris Island to do this. She's a killer and they're killers. You're left to think about the real motivation that she has, forgetting the political aspects of it, and the motivation they have to have, which is a professional one, which has to be trained into them, and which in the end probably isn't as strong as it is.
Do you think that the difficulty of a war film is that whatever you do to not to involve the audience into the battle, finally you become involved and you get a thrill even at it?
Doesn't he have this man at the end quote saying, "Take the glamour out of war, that's impossible"? It's true. I mean, there obviously is something about it that's incredibly spectacular. Obviously, when you read the memoirs of people that have survived the war, many of them look back on it as being the greatest moments of their lives. There must be an aspect to it that is genuinely inspiring and spectacular in the real sense of the word. And the elements of, you know, comradeship, you know, loyalty, courage, those things, in retrospect, people who take part in it are moved. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the political aspect or even the overall ethical question, you know, wouldn't it be nice if there never were wars? But I don't think you have to not make a war film for fear that people will...
I don't think the battle scenes you really get excited about, you know.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, you certainly, even if you're frightened by it, there's some kind of a thrill. You know, the explosions will always look beautiful, and the sound effects always sound interesting. There is a problem there, but this is the Jungian duality of man, altruism and cooperation, you know, versus xenophobia and aggression. You know, the fact that people do not see the dark side of themselves and tend to externalize evil. You see it even in just, you know, disputes between people that, you know, when you say he only sees his side of it, people do only see themselves as good and everybody else is either weak or evil. Classical reaction, the way people react, he looks at him and he says, "Whose side are you on, son?" "Our side." There is always a problem when people are confronted with the shadow side. I don't regard myself as one thing or the other. I'm a aesthetic opportunist. Psychotic is a guy who's just figured out what's really going on.
You would like that?
And I do. I like Burroughs. That's a great quote. You know, there was so much wonderful documentary material in Vietnam, you know, that had not been shot in any other war, including scenes of men dying. There was a lot that you could learn from that. More than perhaps someone who was there, because you could have spent a year there and not seen anything. I mean, most troops were never involved in fighting, and you know, most patrols never even stepped on a mine. Most patrols were just lugging 60 pounds in 100-degree heat for 5 days and nothing happened. Very few people saw action. Looking at sort of, you know, 100 hours of documentary film actually probably tells you more than if you were there and didn't actually have combat.
Yes, you had a project about the Civil War.
Except the Civil War was a war that you can say both sides certainly had vital interests at stake. Vietnam War, you know, was all these fancy theories about, you know, falling dominoes and political consequences, which obviously never occurred. Even when at the point where they realized that that now there was no way to win, there was this problem of how do you get out without suffering the political consequences.
You started by making almost a whole movie. Why did you decide to do Fear and Desire, not reading a book?
No, in fact, that's what one of the films that convinced me that I should start with a good story, because that was a very arrogant, flippant script put together by myself and a boy that I knew who was a poet, where we thought that we were geniuses.
Nope.
You know, it was so incompetently done and undramatic. I learned a lesson from that. I mean, ideas, unfortunately, don't make good films. I mean, there's a lot of artistic work that has to go along with presenting an idea. Even if the film is not very good. I remember James Agee. He saw the film and he looked very pained, and he said, well, he said, there's too much about it that's good for me to just say that it's pretentious, or some remark like that. And he was right. I guess for an amateur film, you could say there were some things about it was good, although I think he was being very generous. But I know what he meant. At least it had the ambition of having some ideas in it, and I suppose you could say, in that sense, there's some continuity with with the rest of my films, which I've also tried to make sure that, you know, they weren't just hollow entertainment. That's about the only connection. Well, the drill instructor in this film, I think, is as naive as the boys are. I mean, he's just programmed to do that, and he's not really the villain at all of the piece.
No.
I don't think.
Not as much as the higher echelon.
Yeah. Who are only shown indirectly through the lieutenant, you know, of this
Establishment.
false way of trying to present the war to the American public. And I suppose the colonel, who demands, you know, singularity, not duality from his soldiers. Even a good war has the problems of the men versus the general. In this case, it was really, you know, the men versus the unreality of what they were being told to try to do.
After these wars, nothing will be like before.
Well, mind you, I mean, life has a tendency of moving along like that anyway. I mean, after almost anything, nothing is like that again. Life does keep changing.
Certainly World War I marks a big turning point. Certainly the Vietnam War for America.
Well, I think it taught America that, you know, you don't fight a war because some intellectuals decide that it might be a good thing. Yeah, I don't think you're going to get Americans to fight a war again unless they think it really means something to them. Certainly, you're not going to be able to sell them something which is quite clear to everybody, you know, doesn't vitally affect them.
You have no other project?
No, I wish I did. Don't want to wait so long because it's too long. I wouldn't like to, I mean, if I had a story right now, I wouldn't particularly want to start immediately because it does start to feel like a lot of work. You know, you work very long hours for a very long time, and you really don't do anything else. When you're filming, you know, you get up at, I don't know, 5 o'clock. If you want to not be tired, you've got to go to bed around 10. If you fall behind in the editing, you get up later, but you wind up working a very long day. Mm-hmm. We were working until 6 in the morning every day. Working backwards. It takes about a year, it takes about 6 months to shoot it. If it's a complicated picture with research, it takes about a year to carefully prepare it. So that's 2.5 years. So now the question is, how long does it take you to find a story? You know what I mean? That's the problem. This one took about 2 years. That's the whole thing. If I could find a story now, you know, I could have a film out, say, in, I don't know, 3 years easily.